hello. There's people arriving. Before we start, I'm just going to set up my slides. Nope. I need to move that. Oh, here we go. Great. All ready to go. We had a little glitch link issue with the link to join this this session today. So I'm so pleased you're here, and some people might be a little bit late because they might be checking the new email that was sent with the correct link. Hello, Claire. So I'm just let's go over a little bit of admin before we start. Hello, Emma. If you're here, you can come and say hello if you like. I'll just give a few minutes for people to come in. We did have thousands of people signed up for these 2 live workshops. So hopefully there'll be a lot of people dropping in. So I don't want to start early just in case. Hello in Denver, USA. Isn't it amazing? I love being so far apart but so connected. Hello, Caitlin. Hi, Anna. Hi, Claire. Hi, Lisa. Oh, hello, everyone. Hello, Catherine. So a few little things to remember, a little bit of admin. If you wouldn't mind, when you're commenting, would you be able to make sure that it's set to panelists and attendees so that firstly, we can see your questions, because at the end of this workshop, I'll spend some time going through your questions, but we need to be able to see them. And also for other people to see your questions, other people might see that you're asking something they're thinking of. And so as a way of not doubling up, it's just kind of good for everyone to see them all. Hello, Liz. Hi, Rach. Hi, Estelle. Hello, everyone. So that would be great. Emma and Claire are both here, who will be able to comment on your questions as we go through potentially, or if you're asking for links, such as the link to Brains Behaviours, which officially opened for registrations yesterday. And I'm happy to answer your questions about Brains Behaviours at the end of this workshop. I know the reason a lot of you are here is because you've been waiting to do this course. People wait on the wait list for Brains Behaviours for up to 6 months, and I get emails all the time from people saying, I just don't want to miss out. We opened for registrations last night. We will be taking registrations for 1 week. You will not miss out, and I'm happy to answer all of your questions at the end of this workshop. When you signed up for this, you would have received the email which had a printable worksheet on it. So if you printed that out, make sure you've got it here. If you did not print out the worksheet, now is your time to run and grab a journal or a piece of paper and a pen. And we can do this right now. Okay, so grab a paper, grab some paper, grab a pen, grab the sheet if you'd printed it out and forgotten to bring it with you. I also just want to let you know that anything you write on this sheet is confidential. I will not be asking anybody to share. There will be, it'll be private. So no matter what you write, no matter how vulnerable you are, and how much you really deeply own your struggles here, the things that you write down on your worksheet, no one else will know about it, okay? This is between you and you. It's all very confidential here. So if you need to make the worksheet now, if you've got yourself a piece of paper, I need you to divide it into 2 columns. The first column will be called behaviours you feel totally fine about. You might hear a helicopter in the background. There's a fire somewhere near us, and there's been a helicopter coming back and forth dropping water. So you're probably going to hear that throughout the next hour. Behaviours you feel totally fine about. And be proud of those behaviours, because sometimes we are conditioned to feel like we need to fix and change and help and support all of the behaviours. And so it can be really hard to get to a place where we totally accept. So good on you. And in the second column, it's going to say behaviors that you still kind of struggle with a little bit, or you don't deeply, wildly, fully accept yet. And if you can just write down the things that come to mind about your children and where they fit which column, or your students, whatever capacity you're here in this workshop under. We are going to be focusing today on the second list, behaviours, needs, neurotypes that we might be struggling to deeply, deeply, fully embrace and accept. And it can be difficult to admit those things, because I know that you wouldn't be here if you didn't want to accept all of that. So don't be hard on yourself. It's totally fine to come and go. And if you can't make this whole session, some people are saying they can't stay the whole time, you'll all receive a replay. And another thing, I will try and get through all of your questions, but I'm not going to look at them during the workshop because I get distracted. And when I get distracted, I go off in another place. And I forget what I was meant to be doing. So we'll come back to those at the end. If you do have time to stay after the workshop, that's when I'll go through all the questions. Before we start, Nadine's asking, are we supposed to be writing about behaviours in our children that are hard to embrace? Yes. Or behaviours in ourselves that are hard to embrace. We are going to be focusing on deeply, deeply, wildly accepting our children and their needs. So absolutely do this exercise for yourself later on. But today we're going to be writing down what it is in our children that we still sometimes struggle to accept. Let's do this. Before I start, I want to pay my respects to the rightful owners of Tomajini country, which is the land that I was born, raised and live on and work from. I acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And this land was not ceded. I'm an uninvited guest on this land, and what we're going to talk about today is information that I have benefited from colonialism. I have been to university. I have worked in institutions and systems that benefit from the colonialism of this country, and I wanted to acknowledge that. And also to say hello and welcome to anyone here watching this who is a First Nations person or Torres Strait Islander, or anyone around the world who is a rightful owner of whichever nation you are on. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And welcome to all of you. Thank you all for being here. Let's do it. So we're going to start off by, I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about our children's brains and what goes on in there, because to understand behaviours, to understand support needs and to understand neurotypes, we really need to understand just what goes on in the brain. And this is for all children, not whether our children are neurodivergent or not. This information is true for all of us. So when we are born, when our babies are born, their brain, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is a blank slate. There is nothing going on in there. There are no neurons talking to each other. There are no neural pathways. There is no way of accessing this part of the brain because it is empty, basically. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that will eventually house the executive functions. So as adults, we have executive functions. Little ones do not. They do not have them yet. The brain develops over time. When we talk about a brain that's developing, that's what's happening. It is literally developing the functions that it needs to work as a fully formed adult brain. The prefrontal cortex is right here behind the forehead. The executive functions will be housed in here, kind of just behind the eyebrows. And the executive functions are basically everything. I'm going to show you a slide right now. The executive functions can be broken down into 3 kind of different categories or areas of working that needs to happen in there. Working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And these 3 things, sort of all of the executive functions can be categorized by these 3 areas. I'm going to flip straight through to the next slide to show you, hang on, what I mean when I say executive functions are everything. Here they are: problem solving, decision making, reasoning, comprehending, organizing, initiating, inhibiting, adapting, analyzing, evaluating. So basically everything that we do that requires some kind of end goal or outcome, requires steps to achieve something, executive functions are involved. Everything that is goal oriented, everything that has an outcome requires executive functioning. The only times we are not really using executive functions are when we're just being completely mindful in a moment or completely present in a moment. Anything that requires an outcome requires these functions. And children, babies are born as a blank slate. There's no executive functioning, and little children, it takes time to develop this stuff. And I'll show you in a minute how much time it takes and when they start to develop it. But let's just have a little deeper look, because when we understand the executive functions, we start to understand how our expectations that we place on our children or our students can sometimes not be aligned with what the neuroscience tells us that they can actually do. So, you know, my eye goes straight to inhibition. This is a big one. Inhibitory control is one of the categories for executive functioning. And, you know, a child has an impulse to do something. If they literally don't have the part of the brain that allows them to inhibit that urge, then they can't stop themselves. You know, if they feel like hitting, if they want to push someone, if they want to bite someone, you know, if they want to pull someone's hair, or if they want to do whatever it is, they get an urge to do something because it feels good, or it's a nice sensation, or they want to be closer to that person, or they're feeling a big emotion, whatever the reason might be. If they have an urge, then they can't inhibit that urge if they literally actually don't have the part of the brain yet that is completely in control of inhibition. I mean, even as adults, it can be difficult to inhibit our behaviors. A couple of years ago, I tell this story a lot. It was more than a couple of years ago now. It was a while ago. I was on a bus. There was a girl sitting in front of me who had a long plait dangling over the back seat right in front of me. And I just wanted to yank it so hard. Like not hard. I mean, I had a very strong urge to yank it because it looked so yankable, if you know what I'm saying. And of course I didn't, because I'm an adult and I do have the capacity for inhibitory control. Not all the times. Sometimes we all have moments where our executive function is difficult to access, and we all have moments where we don't inhibit ourselves, especially when we're in the privacy of our homes. However, you know, on this case, on a bus in public, and I knew that that's not good. That's her autonomy, is her hair, and I can't touch it. And all of the reasons I have as an adult, all the executive functioning I can do as an adult came together to inhibit that particular action, but a child is not going to be able to inhibit that. So every time we have an expectation on a child that they won't hit, that they won't kick, that they won't be rough, we are potentially asking too much. Because also what we're asking for then is for them to reason or make a good decision, to analyze whether they should be doing that thing or not. And they are also executive functions. So when we ask children, if we said, like, I've told you before, we do not have rough hands, or we have gentle hands, you know, I've told you before, we've talked about this. All of those things, talking about this and expecting a child to remember it for next time or to learn from it, that is a process of executive functioning that a child potentially does not have the capacity to do. So they have to understand, they have to reason with what you've said. They have to put that into context of what it means for future times where they're feeling like they need to be rough. And then in the moment, they need to be able to analyze and make a decision. And they are all executive functions. A lot of the things that we expect or say to children that we need them to do or want them to do, no matter how kind and beautiful our intent is, sometimes we are literally asking too much. And this is simply because we know this about the brain now. You know, what we've learned in the last 20 years of neuroscience is remarkable. Nobody knew this before. Our parents didn't know it. Our teachers didn't know it. Their parents and their teachers didn't know it. Everything was very behavioral based. And we did believe that children needed to learn these things and to practice these things. And the truth is we can practice executive functions with our children, but it's not something that they will learn. It is something that they develop over time with age. So it might feel like they are learning these skills, but what's happening is over time, they are growing and aging and their brain is developing. I'm going to show you a slide that represents when executive functions start to develop in children and what that looks like. So you can see that, you know, before the age of 4, they're really not having a lot of development there. And then there's a steep incline. So there's a steep development of executive functioning and activity in the prefrontal cortex. However, you know, they don't have any real great capacity for these skills before they're kind of 6, 7, even 8 years old. And you'll notice that it keeps going up and up until we're 25. So that's the end of adolescence. Adolescence starts at 12 and goes till 25. Typically, executive functioning will continue to develop till we're about 25, and then it's a little bit of a gradual decline from there, as you can see. So we're at our ultimate peak in terms of this kind of functioning when we're in our mid-20s. Now, this graph, I need to point out, is from the textbook, and the textbook always gives us kind of the ultimate version of the average. So what we're looking at is what is a textbook version of what they say should be happening or what they suggest it will look like. This does not cater for neurodivergent brains because, so let me just define neurodivergent. Neurotypes, okay, so neurodivergent, if you or your children are neurodivergent, you have a neurotype that is not the neurotypical, or is not what we would call the neuromajority have. So for example, I'm an autistic woman. I totally forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. Sorry about that. I would have told you then. I'm autistic with ADHD. They are my neurotypes. And that means I am neurodivergent. The majority of the population are not autistic or have ADHD. So I don't love the word neurotypical, but that is the word we usually use to define people who aren't autistic or don't have a neurodivergence. And then people who are neurodivergent, we call neurodivergent. So this graph does not cater for neurodivergent growth and development of executive functioning. We know that especially autistic children have, and all neurodivergent children actually will have their own trajectory of development. It might look different to this. It might happen slower. It might happen later. Executive functioning processes might take more time. So you might ask a child to do something and they might need time to process that. And the neural pathways to the prefrontal cortex are really long when they're coming from the back of the brain. Those neural pathways have to be really, really long. So it can take time because the executive functions happen here. So we're talking about pathways that go across the entire length of the brain. So physically they take time, but also if we are neurodivergent and executive functioning, our executive functioning might be lower or lesser than what the textbook says is the average. We will see that in children. We will see that they are either having difficulty with those functioning skills, or they are not able to, they just don't develop some of those skills, or it might happen slower or later or in their own time. And there's no graph, there's no textbook graph that can define that for us, because you know, that sort of research isn't available in terms of neurodivergent brains. And also we are all so different that some people have very strong, hyper-connected executive functioning capacities. And some of us have very hypo or lesser connected neural pathways to our executive function. So it's a very mixed bag of how that might look. But I just needed to let you know that it's not always going to look like the textbook graph, and nor should it. There is no right or wrong when it comes to brain development. There is no one type of brain is better. There is no, we should be meeting this standard. You know, if your child is older than 6 to 8 and they're still really struggling with this stuff, that is totally okay. And that is no lesser than a child who is doing all of the things that we're asking them to do. And, you know, it might be that we are asking children to do these things. We might be asking them to sit on the mat. We might be asking them to choose their favorite, choose someone to be in their team, or to initiate a conversation, or we might be asking someone to flexibly transition from one room to the next and expect that to just happen seamlessly. And some children might be doing it. But if they are younger than the graph we've just seen, and that they actually don't have executive functional capacity yet, then they might be doing those things, but it's not because of their executive functioning. It could be because it's what they feel like doing. It could be because they're doing what the other kids are doing. It might be because of their temperament, or they just like to please, and they feel that satisfaction that comes with doing what's been asked, but it's not necessarily reflective of their level of executive functioning. And when you really look at everything on this list and all of the things we expect from our little ones, and then we look at the graph of when they actually do develop executive functions, and we think, you know, kids in childcare, kindy, prep, grade 1, even grade 2, we have high expectations behaviorally and what we expect of those children to be able to do. And in many, many, many cases, our expectations are too high, because they literally, actually, physically, neurologically do not have the capacity to do it. Like, they actually can't do it. And it's not because they're not trying. And the more we expect children to do things that require executive functioning, which they are unable to complete, the worse that little children start to feel about themselves. We're going to go to actually, I want to show you one more slide here about the development of executive functioning. I like this quote by Lally. Lally says that, you know, during this formative period of executive functioning or brain development, it's really important to create a climate of care with healthy brain growth in mind. So young children develop and function well when provided care in safe, interesting, and intimate settings where they establish and sustain secure and trusting relationships. Basically what Lally is saying, and I'm just gonna, sorry Lally, but I'm gonna paraphrase you. Little children need to feel loved, safe, and connected. And when they feel loved, safe and connected, their brain is in the best possible position for growing and developing. So we do tend to think, oh, we've got to practice those things. We've got to practice sitting on the mat. We've got to practice crossing our legs. We've got to practice not speaking when someone else is speaking, or we've got to practice not hitting. We've got to practice all the things. Practice getting used to this because, you know, they need to know this. We tend to think that practicing and learning is what will help our children, because that's what in the past we've believed, because we didn't know how the brain worked. We now know. And we know that the brain, it's not about practicing and learning, although repetition and practice is helpful for the brain, but it's not something they're going to learn. It's something they're going to develop. and the brain develops when it feels loved, safe, and connected. This does not mean that any child who's experienced trauma, who's been in an unsafe situation, who's experienced, lots of difficulties in their lives, that does not mean that they necessarily, that their executive functioning will be impacted. We all have the potential to find safety and connectedness and love, even if that doesn't happen from day one. This does not mean that your little ones, your little students or children who've experienced traumas are necessarily going to be impacted. And it might mean that their executive functions develop differently to how the textbook says it should look. And that's okay as well, because as I said, there is absolutely no right or wrong when it comes to brain development. And all of us go through stages where our executive functions are a bit, off. They're one of the hardest, executive functions are one of the hardest things for our brain to do. And they're one of the first things to go whenever we're feeling a little bit like, out of sorts. We're tired, or we haven't eaten properly, or we're emotional, or we've had a fight with someone. We know what it's like. If we have a fight with our husband or our wife or our friend or whatever, then we can't think straight for a while. And that means it's hard for us to make decisions, hard for us to inhibit our impulses, hard for us to analyze what's going on, because we're in our emotions and our executive functions just kind of switch off. So it's hard for us as adults to always have access to our executive functioning. So it's particularly difficult for children. We're going to look at our list now. And what I want you to do is take your pen, look through the behaviors in the column that says behaviors you still struggle with a little bit. I want you to tick or underline or circle any of those behaviors that you struggle with that you feel are probably happening because your child does not yet have the capacity to engage in executive functions, or just doesn't have executive functioning capacity yet. Because we will find that almost the enormous majority of the things that we expect of children, they literally don't have the capacity to do. And so when we can identify that, we can see that our expectations are where the problem is, not their actual behavior or their need. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just go through that list and give it underline or a circle. We're going to next look at the limbic system, because it's important to understand emotions. And the limbic system is the part of the brain that's basically in charge of our emotions. It is in charge of our threat response. It's the part of our brain that detects potential threat. So it's really highly correlated with anxiety. And the limbic system is that place in the brain where all of the urges and the drives and the instincts and the emotions sort of are centered and come from. I tend to think of the brain a little bit like having a pedal and a brake, but think of the two pedals as like cognition, which is executive functioning, what we've just spoken about, and then emotion. This is in a nutshell. I tend to think of the limbic system as emotion and the prefrontal cortex, or the executive functions, as cognition. It's like in a car, you kind of can't have them both down at the same time. So we're not going to be highly emotive and highly switched on cognitively at the same time. We know this to be true. I mean, like in the example I gave a moment ago, if we're really emotional, if we've just had a fight with our partner, or, we've had a really difficult whatever, it's going to be very difficult for us to then step into an exam or an interview, or, onto a workshop like this, for me to be able to then speak cognitively and with all of the things that are reasoned and analysed and all of the executive functions. Likewise, when we are switched on cognitively, we're not necessarily feeling our emotions. So we're not feeling sadness, we're not feeling the jealousy or the anger or the rage or the fear or the anxiety. When we're switched on and when we're really highly cognitive, we're not in that moment accessing the emotions. So it's kind of like one or the other. And it's, what I like is this really nice middle place where it's kind of like but adults sometimes tend to just be all on cognitively, like thinking, rationalizing, and then we think that we can rationalize our emotions away. But what's actually happening is when we're rationalizing and cognitively discussing with our friends about how we feel, our emotion pedal is just not on. So the emotions are not moving, they're just getting stuck inside us. And emotion is very literally energy in emotion. You would have heard me, for those of you who already know me, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm so sorry I forgot to introduce myself. But those of you who do know me, you would have heard me say this so many times. Emotion is energy in motion. It needs to move through us. Now, children are really highly emotionally driven. Their limbic system is basically in control because they don't have the executive functions they need yet to be cognitively and rationally in control. So they are driven by emotions, and they are brilliant at allowing the emotions to move through them. They cry when they need to, they scream when they need to, they slam and smash and stomp and yell and all of the things when they need to. Us adults tend to have these social rules about where we can be emotional or to who and for how long. And even with our closest friends, we might like emotionally let go and, let it all out for a certain amount of time. And then we kind of go, okay, now I've got to ask how they're going. Like there's a limit. It's all very rational and well cognitively defined into unwritten rules of how we should emotionally express ourselves. Children don't have those. So when we think of children as emotionally dysregulated, mostly children, what they are doing is emotionally regulating because they are feeling a lot of emotions because their brain is driven by emotions. And so, of course, their emotions are going to come through them. And it's very healthy and normal and natural and to be expected. And when we try and subdue children's emotions or tell them to stop crying or that they've had, or to think when they are, we tend to think children can get too emotional and that is when it becomes emotional dysregulation. But the actual emotional dysregulation is when we aren't allowing emotions to move. So us adults could learn a lot from children. But what happens when the limbic system is highly active? There's a little part in the limbic system called the amygdala. Just a tiny little guy, is just a little bit that's in there. And he doesn't have a gender, but I'm just calling him he, is in charge of the threat response. So he's kind of like the bodyguard. So at the smallest anticipation of anything dangerous or risky, the amygdala will become hyperstimulated and will go put us into survival mode, and he'll be like, right, I'm here to save you, because our brain's only job is to keep us alive. That is how humans have evolved. That's how we've stayed alive. We need the amygdala. If we didn't have that threat response, humans would never have kept alive. So we need it, but in this very modern Western world we live in now, our limbic system, and in fact our entire brain, has a harder time than it ever has before, because in this post-industrial world, our environments are super packed with too much sensory information, too many options, too many choices. So much has changed, and humans throughout the whole of history, human brains throughout the whole of human history have never, ever, ever had to deal with the sheer volume of sensory information. And we're not going to talk about sensory overload today. We'd spend 2 weeks on that in Brains Behaviours. There's so much to talk about. But our brains are absolutely bombarded. So our amygdala is mostly always hyperactive, and we are detecting a lot of threat and potential danger in our environment where in fact there is none. The brain cannot tell the difference between a real threat or a perceived threat. So if your child is in the ocean and they accidentally get tangled up in a rip and it takes them off their feet and they're getting under the water and it's frightening, and their brain will put, their amygdala will become hyper activated and it will put them in survival mode, and they will hopefully somehow get themselves out and they'll be frightened, but the brain did what it needed to do to save them. Likewise, your child could be in a classroom with 20 other kids and someone says something unexpected, or a voice that you hadn't heard, the child hadn't heard before spoke, or someone shut a door, or someone accidentally bumped someone, and boom, amygdala's doing the exact same thing and putting them in that exact same state of survival mode, fight or flight or fawn. And that is not necessarily what we want. That is happening because our amygdalas are hyperactive, and they are hyperactive or hyperconnected because of the pressures in our environment on our brain. And that is just a product of living in this modern Western world where we have so much. I'm going to show you a slide now about what happens when we're in survival mode. Let's move past this one. This is an adapted version of the polyvagal chart and the polyvagal theory, which looks at the nervous system and the brain and what happens in there. You might already know about, if you're a teacher, you've probably heard of the zones of regulation, and some of you might have learned about the zones of regulation as well, especially if you seek occupational therapy. This is a really good way of understanding what regulation looks like and how it might occur in our children. So this is, the bottom one is social engagement is the green zone. We call it the green zone because that's where we are in flow, we are connected, we're cruising, we're just, we're playing, the kids are playing happily, they're flexibly, the plan might change and they're like, fine. They feel very settled and grounded, and in our body we feel safe, and this is the feeling we love. We love feeling like we're in the green zone. Our minds are curious, we're engaged, and our body feels safe. Typically, we would find that a lot of children, maybe the majority of children, I believe we're not seeing this so much anymore, especially this year, given that we're in a global pandemic. But typically what the aim is, or the expectation is, that we spend most of our lives in the green zone, and then at times of heightened stress, we sort of go up into the yellow zone where we're in fight flight. That's when we're in survival mode. We feel the anxiety, we feel the anger, we feel the fear, and then we call on our resources that make us feel safe again, and we go back down to the green zone. And so there's this expectation that life ultimately would be about living in the green zone, going up into the yellow, and then back to the green. Back up to the yellow, back to the green. What we find for children who have, certainly for neurodivergent children and people, this is the same for adults, but I'm contextualizing it in terms of our children because that's what we're here for. We are finding more and more people living in a state of fight or flight, survival mode, which is what we call the yellow zone. We're still in control, mostly in control of our behaviors. We are feeling the rage, we are feeling the anxiety. So survival mode is what it's called in the brain when we get into that heightened state of arousal. Because the limbic system has become like highly active. And so we go into this state of survival mode, and what we experience physiologically is anxiety. So anxiety is a physiological experience of survival mode. In our body, we will feel shortened, faster breaths, our heart rate will go up, the body might tense up, we might feel numb, we might feel cold, we might feel nauseous, our digestion suffers. Quick temper, or low threshold for change and fear. We might cry a lot and be upset and have lots of worried thoughts. This is the typical survival mode state of regulation. And in fact, I think most of us spend a lot of time in this zone, and it has become normal. It has become normal to feel on edge and to not have enough energy, to feel irritated. And a lot of that is simply because of the volume of information in our environments that our brain just does not have the capacity to process and integrate and action. And if our brain just can't keep up with all the demands of the environment, it puts us into survival mode because it doesn't know necessarily that we're safe. So we spend a lot of time in this zone, and I think a lot of us have forgotten what it feels like to really be in the green. And when children are in this stage of fight or flight, and I want to add fawn to the end of this, because fawning is a survival mode response that we don't know as much about. We know it now, but it's relatively new in the conversation. It's very common to talk about the context of forming within trauma response. Fawning is when we people please as a survival response. So that is when we are in survival mode, we are feeling anxious or angry or irritated. We are in that heightened state. And to survive, we people please, we say yes, we do what we're asked, we say the right thing, we try and fit in, we try not to upset anyone. I am a fawner. And I did not recognize, you know, my autistic identity was not recognized until I was 36. And I can see so clearly when I look back on my childhood how I was fawning as a way of not letting anybody see that I was in the yellow zone, or sometimes the red zone, which we haven't got to yet. And so I can understand why nobody would have recognized this externally. Fight, it's easy to see. If children are hitting, punching, biting, pushing, you know, if they're running away, flight, it's easy to see those things externally. Fawning is often an internal process, and because we ideally want our children to go with the status quo, go with the flow, do what they're asked, we kind of consider those things to be positive, and we want our children to do that. It pleases us. It can be very difficult to recognize when that is an actual survival response. And fawning is something that it's probably easier to recognize in ourselves when we're old enough to start to realize that we are saying yes to things when inside we want to say no. And it's really common. It's so common. And our children are doing it. And so you might not recognize anxiety externally, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And then we get into an even higher state of arousal where the nervous system is sort of sympathetic dominance, which means it's in a really high alert stage of like, I'm not coping right now. And that's when it becomes really difficult. This is a horrible, horrible feeling and a horrible place to be. And we can start to really dissociate from our bodies and feel numb and not feel our feelings. And we start to really shut down. We don't tend to spend as much time in that heightened state as we do in the yellow zone. Now, the reason all this is important is because our children are driven by their limbic system, because they don't yet have, remember the two pedals? They don't have the cognition yet. They can't do it because there's no executive functions. So they are driven by their limbic system. That means they are driven by their emotions. Their emotions are highly attuned, highly responsive. And because their amygdala is constantly on and detecting all this threat, they are experiencing a lot of survival mode. And when we are in survival mode, we are going to be not necessarily able to do the things that are expected of us. We might not feel safe. We might not feel like we can go to school. The children might not be able to eat because they're feeling nauseous. You know, when you're anxious and you can't eat, you know, and a lot of the things that we expect or want for our children are literally not possible because they are in this highly emotive state. So let's go back to our list. And I want you to sort of circle, tick, underline any of those things in there that you feel, the behaviors that you are struggling with in your child or struggling to accept. I want you to kind of identify which ones of those you feel are happening because your child is experiencing survival mode or potentially anxiety. Because that will also give us an insight to where our expectations or our perspective on their needs or their behaviours might also be where the actual problem lies, not with them, but with our perception. I'll give you a minute to go through the list. I can see your questions. I really want to start answering them, but I know if I do, I will get off track. So this is the biggest part of what we're talking about today, because really understanding where our expectations are a little bit out of whack with what we can actually physically expect from our children, because they just don't have the capacity to be any other way or to need what they need in that moment any differently. That is in fact the biggest area in which our shift will come from, is realizing that our expectations are often a little bit too high. But we're going to talk next about two very, very important things: fear and conditioning. These are big deals. We experience, as parents, caregivers, teachers, educators, service providers, whatever role we are to our children, we experience fear on behalf of them. We feel fear for them. Fear is, okay, although the feeling of fear is real and tangible and we experience it in the now, the actual fear is actually something that is potentially happening in the future. So whenever we fear something, it's about a potential outcome that may or may not even happen somewhere in the future. It is not a real thing. It's not happening now. The feeling of fear, I don't mean to minimize fear, because it's a big deal. And if we feel fear, it's important not to try and deny it. Accept that we feel fear, because there is no such thing as a negative emotion. Any emotion we are feeling is real and valid and should be accepted. So we can feel fear, the feeling of it, the felt sense of it, but the actualization of fear is something that may or may not even happen down the track. But we feel fear around for our children because we want things to be easy for them. We don't want them to experience pain. We don't want them to be left out or ostracized. We want them to meet the standards of their peers or have, you know, and we don't want this for, I mean, I know that you are not here because you want those. I know that the reasons you are here is because you want those things for your children, because your intent and your compassion is so great that you just want them to have the best, most fulfilling possible future that, you know, you could be part of creating for them. But we are conditioned to feel fear by all of the words that we hear and all of the things that we say and all of the things that are going on around us all the time keep us in a perpetuate a sense of fear just by the very existence of these words in our culture. I'm going to show you a slide. Move past that. Here we go. Fear perpetuating words. Now all these words came in about 15 minutes yesterday. So these words, this is by no means an exhaustive list. But if you look at all of these words, and these are words we hear all the time, they have negative connotations, they induce fear, and they make us think that something needs to change, that these are bad or wrong, and instead they should change, or there should be something else. Or this is the bad version of whatever the good version is that we want to aim for. And we hear these words all the time. Let's just go through a couple of them. Misbehavior. We know that behaviors, this is what the whole of Brains Behaviours is all about. Behaviors are never, ever, ever, ever the problem. Behaviors are always, every single time, the byproduct of what is going on in the brain, the nervous system, the body. The behavior is never the problem. So when we focus on the behavior or fixing the behavior or changing the behavior, or we talk about misbehavior, we are completely denying the fact that that thing is only happening because of this thing. And, you know, to be fair, it is, like I've said before, it's only in the last 20 or so years that we've understood the brain and that we've known about all of this and we've understood how the brain develops. Even when I was studying my Master of Music Therapy, what I learned about brain development then, we know now not to be true. And that was less than 20 years ago. So it is no wonder that our parents did believe in misbehavior, and their parents did, and their parents did, and our teachers and their teachers and their teachers did, because it was a very behavioral focused paradigm where we focused on changing the behaviors. We know now that there is no such thing, that to do that is not going to support our children's needs at all. So misbehavior, this word that is still being used, has no place apart from to make us feel that our child is doing the wrong thing or the bad thing. Helicopter parent, that's a triggering word right there. You know, for a lot of us, especially if our children are experiencing anxiety or they're in survival mode or they have complex support needs or they just need a little extra, they need to feel loved and safe. They need to feel connected. And we know that by being near them or supporting them or scaffolding for them, that it's going to be what they need. We instinctively know that about them. And now we know it from neuroscience because we've talked about the brain needing to feel safe, loved, and connected. Yet there are words like helicopter parent that fly around that make us think, oh, we're doing the wrong thing, or perpetuate a sense of you shouldn't be doing this. You should be doing that. There are so many words here that are a little bit triggering. Your child is doing too much of this or not enough of that. Those words, too much, not enough, they perpetuate a sense of they shouldn't be doing this, they should be doing that. Or that shouldn't be happening, this shouldn't be happening. And all of those connotations of this needs to change keeps us in a perpetuated experience of fear on behalf of our children. It is no wonder that we feel and that we make decisions and our expectations for what we want for our children and the reasons that we sometimes struggle to accept some of the things they're doing or how they're acting or behaving or some of their needs and even their neurotypes. It's no wonder that deep, 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 honest, full, complete acceptance can be challenged. And that's because we're fearful. And look, you know, when we were little, children were treated differently when they were neurodivergent or when they had needs that needed to be catered for in the classroom. If they couldn't sit still, if they rocked on their chair, if they chewed their collar or sucked their thumb or chewed their hair, or they needed to go out into the other classroom to do some sort of extra program with a teacher's aid, there was a focus on those children being different. And they were discriminated against. And we experienced that as children. And our fear comes from our experience of being children in a time and place when discrimination was so much more obvious than it is now. And we do not want our children to be discriminated against. And that is a strong, we are their advocates. We will not have discrimination for our children and our students. So we fear for them. But what we potentially don't realize, because we weren't brought up as children right here and now, is that especially right at the moment, the focus on inclusivity and diversity is moving faster and faster in the right direction than it ever has before. We are questioning binaries. We're really, really beautifully accepting diversity in so many different ways. And I hope for our children and our students that they won't even realize. They will know who's autistic, they will know who has ADHD or who has difficulty with this or who has difficulty with that, and it won't matter. And it won't be that they have to hide their neurotype to be accepted. It will just be that everyone has their own way and everyone is enough. And so when we start to think of what it's going to be like for our children, it really helps to put our fears from our conditioning from when we were children at bay, and to give us perspective of the fact that our fear might be something we are holding on to, but might not necessarily be something that will come to reality for our children. So let's look at our list. Let's look at our list again. I want you to identify, and these can cross over. So you might have already you might have already circled or ticked these behaviors the first time we went through and we looked at executive functions. You can, these things can cross over. I want you to go over the list and see which of those behaviors you struggle to accept on behalf of your child because of fear. It might be that you fear your child even going through a process of assessment and diagnosis because you don't want your child to be labelled, which is another one of these fear perpetuating words. Because when we say labelled, what we mean is I don't want my child to be discriminated against. Diagnosis is wonderful. Diagnosis gives us the clarity we need to know who we are and who our children are. It helps them develop an identity. It helps us know how to support their needs so that their life can be just amazing and fulfilling. Yet the thought of being labelled, which means discriminated against, is what holds us back. I'll give you a minute to go through that list. And lastly, and this one will be quick, I want to look at conditioning, because we were children once and we heard a lot of phrases and we were told a lot of things that from a very, very early age shape our framework of what is truth. They shape our reality. And it can be very, very difficult to shed or get rid of deeply ingrained patterns of truth or belief systems that we have, especially the ones that were formed when we were really young. So I'm about to show you a slide that might be triggering for some of you. And it's a bunch of phrases that a lot of people heard when they were children, that sometimes we might find ourselves saying these things. We might find these words popping out our mouth before we can stop them. And even as we're saying them, we know that this isn't helpful. This isn't what I believe. This is not serving anyone. And you hear your own mother or your father or your grandparent or your teacher, you hear your elders' words coming out your mouth. These are deeply conditioned phrases. Again, this is by far no means an exhaustive list. This is just a handful. Because I said so. Stop making things difficult for me. What is wrong with you? These are things that our parents have said. These are things that our teachers have said. And this is things that their parents and their teachers said to them. They were conditioned exactly the same way. And as we know, our parents, when they were bringing us up, they didn't have the benefit of neuroscience to understand about neuroplasticity and to understand about moving away from these deeply conditioned patterns or truths that no longer serve us. They're not true. We believe them to be true because they're conditioned into us. And so, we're really probably one of the first generations to be able to understand that when these thoughts come to our head, even if they don't come out our mouth, even if we don't say them out loud to your children, don't be a sook. I don't know what I did to deserve you. We might stop ourselves before we say these things out loud, but we often hear these words in our head. They pop back in the moments when we might be feeling these things or thinking these things to ourselves, even if we've got the impulse control to make sure they don't come out our mouth. And these deeply conditioned phrases shape so much of our expectations and our wants and our desires for our children, that these and the phrases you might have heard as a child might not be here. This is just a handful, but I'm sure that you could do this exercise where you might want to, on the other side of the worksheet, there's just a whole bunch of blank lines. You might want to start brainstorming down the things that you heard as a child and identify what they are and start to become aware of, are the things I heard as a child shaping my expectations for my child and making it really difficult for me to accept my child and what they need right here and now in this moment? And I think the answer will be yes. We're human. We're human. We all experience this. It's not a bad thing. It's just what it is to be human. And becoming aware of it is the first step to shifting our expectations. So this is the last question I'm going to ask you. Go back to your list and have a look, like what in there that you are struggling to accept about your children. For example, one in my life, something I really struggled with for a while is that my family doesn't sit at the dinner table together of an evening. It was very difficult to make that happen. I'm autistic. I'm also raising neurodivergent children, and we all have our own quite complex needs when you put a whole family together. And by the end of the day, one of my children needs a lot of space, and one of my children needs a lot of time to move and just to not sit at the table and engage in that beautiful family dinner. You know, I have lived my life believing that that is the pinnacle of what a family should do, is to come together at the dinner table at the end of the day and talk and laugh and share our stories and sometimes fight, but be there together. And, you know, all of the blogs and everyone will tell you that have the family that dines together, you know, that's what you're meant to do. And I could not accept that that wasn't able to happen in my family, because I felt like that's what needed to happen. And when I was able to let go of that thing that I was struggling with and blaming on my children because they couldn't come to the table, they couldn't stay at the table, they wouldn't sit at the table, I was blaming it on them. And when I realized my expectation was not meeting their capacity or their need, and that my expectation was based on a deeply ingrained, conditioned thing that made me think that us being at the dinner table together at an evening is what our family needs to be a good enough or a proper family. And when I was able to look at that and go, actually, that's not true. That's not our truth right now. That's just something that culture says. When I was able to let go of that, so much changed and so much became easier. Now, what happens when you get through to the end of this list? If there are any behaviors, if there is anything on there that you've written that you are struggling with to accept and to be okay with, then whatever is left over, they are the things you focus on. Because I will guarantee, well, I better not guarantee. I would say I'm 99.999% sure that anything that is still on that list that you're struggling to accept as okay is because it's dangerous, risky, detrimental to your child's health or to other family members' health or safety. And those are the things that that you then need to focus on. No matter how extreme those things are, I mean, they could be self-harm, they could be really dangerous things that, no, it's not okay and you can't accept it. No matter how big those things are, they are still not the problem. The thing that you are struggling to accept is not the problem. The behavior is always, always, always a byproduct of what's going on in the brain. So even if they are really dangerous, risky, detrimental things that you just can't have, we don't need to focus on the things. We focus on what's going on in the brain, and we identify what their need is. And we identify their regulatory state, and we learn to co-regulate and self-regulate. And that is what Brains Behaviours is all about. That is not something we can work on right now because I'm already going over time. But I'm giving you permission now to know that all of the things that you ticked, underlined, circled, highlighted, those things are on you. Those things are not on your children to change. And this is not a bad you, change. This is not saying that. This is saying that we are humans. Of course, we are led by fear. We are making fear-based decisions all the time because we love our children. And of course, we are conditioned by the things we heard as children because we are humans. And of course, we are going to have behavioral expectations for our children because we didn't know the neuroscience until now. But now that you do know, now that you have that information, just having the light bulb moment of it all making sense is enough to start the shift in you. You don't have to now go, right, how am I going to address all this? Just knowing the truth about it is enough to start the shift in perception, and you will find that your expectations and your perception and your frameworks around what you feel is okay and isn't okay, and how deeply you can accept your children's needs and who they are right now, right here and right now, you will find that that starts to shift just because it's all made sense. I hope that was helpful. I hope that I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed this workshop. Thank you so much for being here. And, you know, as I said, so many of you signed up for this because you really want to do Brains Behaviours and you didn't want to miss out. And it is now officially open for registration. So for those of you who don't know about Brains Behaviours, it's my 10-week e-course. I run it twice a year. This is the 7th time we've run this course. It's been going for 4 years now, and it is just getting bigger and bigger with every time we run it. It's, you know, if I can say this myself, I really am very proud of this resource. It's incredibly important. Over 10 weeks, we focus on executive functioning in more depth than what we did today. Anger and anxiety, we focus on more of understanding the brain, not just the limbic system and the executive functioning, but heaps more. We focus on sensory overload, and we look at hyperactivity and meltdowns and communication. We have a whole bunch of bonus interviews every week throughout the 10-week course. So throughout the 10-week course, every Monday you will receive small videos of content that relate to each week's theme, and then each Thursday we have a live Q&A with me, just kind of like what we did today, but just all questions that you ask me and I answer. And you have lifetime access to this course. So if you sign up for Brains Behaviours, you do not have to finish it at the same. I have no external expectations on you. You do it in your time in a way that works for you. And you can do the course over and over and over again each time it runs. Some people are doing the course for the 6th time because they just always want to refresh. Those people are amazing. I'm going to, and the Q&A, so I'm just going to go through the questions. I might not answer them all. Emma has sent me some questions so that I can make sure I see them. Is the fawn stage between the yellow and the red, or can it be both depending on the child? It can absolutely be both. Fawning can happen, you know, I think all of us rely on masking and fawning at different times because we know that it's going to be helpful for us in certain situations. The difference when it happens as a survival response is that it's happening because we are struggling and we feel like that is the only way for us to survive. Basically, our brain is telling us to do that thing as a survival response. It can happen in the REM stage, but usually when we're in the red stage, the red zone, when we are freezing or shutting down or we're out of control, that's usually a zone where we don't have the cognitive. So you know how I talked about the 2 pedals? When we're in the red zone, the emotion, the threat, the anxiety pedal is down and cognition is up. So we are less likely then to be thinking things through and cognitively, fawning or people pleasing or saying yes or being involved cognitively, because in this stage we're usually just angry or screaming or laughing hysterically or whatever it might be. So fawning would normally happen in probably the yellow zone. When we're talking about fawning as a survival response, we're talking about being in survival mode. I'm just going to scroll up and then scroll down so I don't miss anything. Rach says, with the graph, she hadn't seen it before. Even as a textbook version, it gives a great starting point. That is so true because, you know, we don't know this stuff until somebody tells us, because this is new science. I mean, it's not new. We know it to be true. It's been empirically like, this is the reality. This is the neuroscience. It's not like we discovered it last week. But when we're involved in systems like the education system and frameworks of parenting that are age old, and the school system is old, it's not based or developed around what we now know to be true. So we can see that the systems that we are in are often really unaligned, disaligned with the capacity that our children actually have to meet the expectations, which is why it's so important to start here with us as the parent or as the teacher, as one person in their life who can alter our expectations and have deep awareness and acceptance of who they are and what they need. Amy says, no wonder school trauma rates are so high. Yeah, and it's, you know, I've got to say, I have so many teachers here in this community, and so many teachers do Brains Behaviours because they are so passionate about understanding everything they can to be as beautifully compassionate and deeply, wildly accepting of their students as possible. So it's very clear to see that mostly it's not, this is not a reflection of teachers, but the system, the expectations that are placed on children of how they need to, the milestones they need to meet, the way they need to perform, and what is expected of them in a classroom or in a school environment. That framework makes it very difficult. And yes, no wonder there is a lot of trauma. I agree. Daniel Potter says, I'm not seeing the list. So this list is the one that you printed out, that you would have printed out when you got the email when you joined the workshop. If you didn't print out, just write your own. And if you missed the beginning, Daniel, just go back. If you missed the beginning of this when we were talking about the worksheet, you'll get the replay and you can go back and you can write up your own list if you like and do this again. Sarah says, can executive functioning skills go offline when a person is overwhelmed? Hell yes. We talked about this. Yeah, that's what happens. When we are in a state of overwhelm, overload, when we experience, I have sensory processing disorder, and I have very specific thresholds for certain sensory systems. And if I hear too much noise or if I have too much touching, and I go into a state of sensory overload, yes, my executive functioning capacity is completely altered to the point where sometimes I can't talk. And I certainly can't complete tasks. So yeah, this it's called the amygdala hijack. When the amygdala, you know, pops up and says, hey, there's a potential threat, the prefrontal cortex is often just like cut, and access to the executive functions are just not there. And that's for adults. So you can imagine how much more difficult this is for children. Could this be a result of mental illness? Yes, it's when we experience depression or mental illness, mental imbalance, yes, we absolutely will experience difficulties in accessing our executive functions. And how this can be handled, basically it's about the very beginning place to experiencing any kind of regulation is to feel safe, loved, and connected. And we will talk in Brains Equal Behaviours in depth about that. Is fast feast a survival mode response? Not typically in the way in which it is a category of its own. However, fasting or feasting is a very common way of attaining control. And when we are feeling not in control, when we are in survival mode is a brain that does not feel in control. When our brain feels in control, it's not in survival mode. So when we fast or feast, when our children stop eating or eat a lot, often that is something that they make the choice to do, that they are doing, even as a survival response, because then it gives their brain a sense of control. And when the brain feels in control, it feels less frightened. So it's not a category of its own, but feasting and fasting is certainly something that we all do, and including children, as a part of being in survival mode, yes, as a way of maintaining control. Yeah, so Barbara asks, where do the inappropriate responses to others getting hurt and others' emotions fit in? Like I said at the very end, any behaviours that are still on there, like if your child is hurting themselves or hurting someone else. Like, you know, this isn't all about little things. Some of these things are really big. And we don't want that for our children, no matter how we frame it. There are some things and some behaviors and some dangerous things going on that we can't accept. They're not okay. We need to work out how we can support our children through those. And that is where our focus needs to lay. What is going on for our child? What need is not being met in such a way that is leading them to do this thing? And that is where Brains Behaviours is really helpful for that. We focus on this. This is one of the things we talk about throughout the whole 10 weeks. An occupational therapist is a really, really good place to go to, or a person to go to. A psychologist is a really good person to go to help get to the bottom of what your child needs, because the behavior is never the problem. It's the underlying need that needs to be supported, that is potentially not being supported, which is the cause, the underlying cause of the byproduct, which is the behavior. Oh, Natalie's said so many of those phrases she heard from her parents. I'm feeling the emotions. Yeah, I mean, I felt emotions reading those two lists as well, the lists of fear perpetuating words and the lists of things that parents say. And also I'm not too proud to admit that I think a lot of those things often in my head, they pop in at times where I know they would have been said to me. And that's a wonderful thing, because it gives me the insight. It gives me that moment of insight. I need to sometimes stop it coming out my mouth. However, that doesn't mean it's not still impacting my expectations of my children. So it gives me a place to really start to shift my perspective, being aware of those things. And it is triggering and it is difficult. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Just going through all the questions. Thank you, thank you. You're amazing. No, you are. Oh, Kim's enrolling. Go you. Registrations will be open for 1 week. I should let you know, Brains Equal, yes, you can get PD points if you do Brains Equal Behaviours. I send everybody a certificate of completion at the end, and it will be a certificate for a minimum of 10 hours. So there is a lot of PD points in there for you. Also, yes, you can access Brains Equal Behaviours using your NDIS funding if you need a tax receipt, an official tax receipt after you register for NDIS purposes. Just email us and say, I need a receipt, I need a proper invoice for my NDIS, and we will send that to you. Or if you need to have the invoice first so that you can get the funds through NDIS to then pay for it, likewise, email us. We will send you an official tax invoice so that you can get the funding through your NDIS plan. Likewise, if you're a teacher or if you're a service provider and your boss or your principal is going to pay for this training for you, as a lot of schools do every time we run it, which is, I think, a beautiful, beautiful thing. We will just email us and let us know that you need a tax receipt for your school. If you are a principal here or someone high up in your school system and you're watching this and going, you know what, I need a group of our teachers to go through this, email us and we'll organise getting a tax invoice to you for a large group. That's fine as well. So it costs 497 Australian dollars. That is for lifetime access for 10 weeks worth of content. And there are payment plans available. So you can pay there's a variety of different ways you can pay if you can't pay that up front. How do you recommend educators approach a child age 5 with a history of trauma who frequently runs out of the classroom? That's absolutely sounds like a fight or flight response. And there's a variety of reasons that could be happening. How do I recommend an educator approaches that? That's a complex question without knowing a lot of information. But the first place is always to recognize that any child is going to be in the best possible space to regulate if they are experiencing a sense of safety, love, and connectedness. So always, 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 always go in there to support that child with a sense of safety, love, and connectedness. And educators are beautiful at that. And I know it's difficult when you're in a classroom with 20 or more children, and yet teachers are still amazing at it. So that's the starting place. And, you know, for any educators here who do have children who've experienced trauma or a classroom, you know, I would say all of us, all classrooms have neurodivergent children in them, whether they know it yet or not. They might never, ever know it because such is the medical world. The assessment processes to diagnose neurodivergences are often designed for a very specific stereotypical version of how that neurotype might present. And so a lot of us, especially women and girls, do tend to have our diagnosis misdiagnosed or not seen. But getting back to the point, any educator here is bound to have, you know, neurodivergent children in their classrooms. So I think this course is a really good PD for anyone who's got a classroom full of children or a large group. Where does shame fit? Oh yeah, shame is fear. Shame fits into all of it. Shame because we didn't know. Shame because we have a scarcity mind frame that's leading us to make decisions based in fear. Shame because we were shamed as children. Shame often shows up as anger and anxiety. So anger is often like sitting above shame or sadness or guilt or fear. We talk about that in week 4, I think, of Brains Behaviours. So you'll find a lot more information about that there. I mentioned not resonating with the term neurodivergent. I highly resonate with the term neurodivergent. I personally don't resonate with the word neurotypical because I feel like we are then categorizing another group of people. I feel like it's a form of othering. Sometimes the neurodivergent community will talk about neurotypicals as if like in kind of a condescending way, and that is not everybody's perspective, but that is mine. I use the word neurotypical because it makes sense and it makes it easier for everyone to understand the context of what I mean. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with the word neurotypical. I certainly love the word neurodivergent. I think it's a really celebratory word. I'm someone who celebrates the autistic culture and celebrates the neurodivergent culture in my family and within my work. I never ever aim to sort of try and fix or change or improve. I personally don't do early intervention. I'm someone who really focuses on actualization as a neurodivergent person within the scope of that person's capacity to be their most actualized, fulfilled person in the world. And I find that a lot of, I feel that there is a big push in the world in all the systems to sort of support children, even in the most genuine, compassionate way. It's still supporting children to fit into neuronormative expectations. And that means trying to get a neurodivergent child to be more like a neurotypical child. And that's not what you asked about, but I just went on a tangent. But I guess it's important to know that all of the information that you will find in my resources, and especially in this course, really aims at understanding our children for who they are, understanding that their needs and especially their behaviours are not things that they are choosing to do. They are never the problem. They're always a byproduct of what's going on. and that I will always promote and work towards deep acceptance rather than trying to support our children to fit in or change or be better or do more or match, you know, what the other kids are doing. Dina says, do I have experience with somatic approach? Yes, I do. Absolutely. And I love somatic approaches is one of the frameworks that I really align with. And we do talk about that kind of stuff in Brains Behaviours. Behaviours. I think we have a tapping, a video with, anyway, I can't remember if we do or not. Anyway, yes, absolutely. So moving our body, physically moving our body is one of the best ways we can move emotions through it, and we can self-regulate. We focus on that a lot in the course. Emma has popped the link to register for Brains Behaviours in the questions. Hi, Ali, do you ever do e-courses on music therapy? So Brains Behaviours is quite, I always forget to tell this part. There is a lot of information in there about how we use music as a tool for regulation. It's not specifically a music therapy course, though there are a lot of music therapists take this course. There are a lot of music therapists who've done Brains Behaviours because it really focuses on what's going on in the brain and then how we can use music as a tool to support the brain to regulate. Thank you all for being here. I'm just so thrilled to have you. I think I've answered as many questions as I can. Some of them have been doubled up. Please do email me any further questions you might have if I didn't get to it. Thank you for being here, and I think you're wonderful, and your children are so lucky to have you. Your students are so lucky to have you, and yes, have a wonderful day. And I would love to see you in Brains Behaviours. I even if you click on the link, it's not going to make you register. You can click on the link and go find out all the things about it that I forgot to tell you about it right now. And I will see you all later. Bye.